John, it's lovely to have you here. And this must be an incredibly busy time for you coming up to Christmas as the person who's been sort of christened Mr. Christmas.
Well, I am slightly associated with Christmas and the music of Christmas, I must say. Sometimes I think I should turn up for rehearsals and concerts in a Santa Claus outfit with a sack of carols over my shoulder. But yes, it's a busy time, but a happy busy time. And I would far rather be associated with Christmas, which is a joyous family kind of time of year, rather than being associated with famine, flood and disaster. So the Christmas thing is always something where I have to prepare my calendar and be sure I'm not double booked. I've got 7 Christmas concerts to do. Then I think I'll be expected to help stuff the turkey. But aside from that, life is normal.
Christmas is a wonderful time for choral music, and I think a time when we see the best of choral worship, actually, because you get these wonderful full congregations. Do you think that we can learn from Christmas worship in taking it into normal worship on an everyday basis and trying to get more people into churches?
Well, I hope that some of the people who come and hear a choir in church or in a concert hall at Christmas time will then want to come and hear that choir or other choirs for all the rest of the year. It's the one time of year where everybody thinks about choirs and gets some exposure to the singing of a choir. And it's so important that Christmas choral worship in church and Christmas concerts are as beautiful and as perfect as they can be, because it may be people's first introduction to the wonderful world of choral singing. And I hope that it will just be an entry point, but people will then go on to say, well, what else can I come and hear for the rest of the year? Or indeed, maybe I could join a choir, which is something that I'm always trying to encourage.
One of the things I love about Christmas services is watching the congregation, particularly when a descant comes in, because for some of them they'll have never heard anything like that before. And I often see a couple of people looking around the room with sort of these faces as if to say, where is this sound coming from? And that must be magnified immensely in the Albert Hall.
5,000 people will start the concert with O Come All Ye Faithful, crowned by the magnificent descant written by Sir David Wilcox, sometime director of King's College Choir. A great descant lights up the sky, and I think there's none finer than that particular one. He wrote it on a train journey coming back from a Bach choir rehearsal in London very shortly before Christmas, where he thought, well, O Come All Ye Faithful could just do with something to add to the last verse. And that's what he did. By the time the train pulled into Cambridge station, it was there. I think photocopiers had just been invented, and he passed the copies round to the choir, and they sang it that Christmas Eve. And the world has been singing it ever since.
I certainly find it almost impossible to not sing the descant. I don't know the tune to that last verse because I've got so used to singing those words to that descant tune instead.
I think it's just about as well known as the tune.
Did you find when your voice broke that you missed singing those descants?
Oh, yes. Yes, I was an angelic boy treble, though I never got the solo in Once in Royal David City because my deadly rival Simon Vaughan at school always got it.
Oh, golly.
But he did then join English National Opera eventually, so I suppose I shouldn't be too envious. But I was passed over.
The politics of Once in Royal solos are a nightmare.
I know. I was spurned. This was at school. We did a festival of lessons and carols that I realised later was modelled very closely on the King's College Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols. And we weren't as good, but we aimed for that sort of standard, and it was very much the style. And I think I had hoped, privately, I never told my mum and dad I hoped I would be chosen as the soloist for Once in Royal David City, but no, it was never me.
It's an impossible one to keep in tune as well, I think. Unless I found doing it in G flat major instead of G seems to do the trick. I don't know how it works mentally, but it tricks your brain into staying in tune.
Ah, well, we get into technical realms for musicians, but it's true that for those of you that studied a little bit of piano or some other instrument, G flat major, the one with all those flats appearing at the start of the piece, is much more voice-friendly than G major, which is the key that Once in Royal David City was actually written in. And so, yes, if you moved it down that semitone, then it would be less intimidating for the choristers. And, of course, congregations have to go up to a top E. Now, again, musicians know that that's pushing it a bit for a congregation. But, yes, E-flat is that little bit much easier. I think the people who do karaoke tracks probably know that because they never go much above a D.
Oh, I never thought about that at all.
Well, you haven't been in a pub, have you?
I was about to say, I haven't done karaoke for a very, very long time.
Right.
But actually, John, one of the things that's amazing about your music is that it makes people sound good. The most amateur choir can try your music and enjoy singing it straight away and sound wonderful singing it straight away. Do you think your experience as a chorister informed that?
Yes. When I write for choir, I always feel I'm coming home to my family because I did play in my school orchestra, but only as fill-in pianist. I didn't play a proper orchestral instrument, but I had to be on hand, so if the bassoon had a football practice instead and wasn't there, I had to fill it in on the piano, and that was actually a good learning experience. But I did sing properly in the school choir. And I was lucky because I was at a boys' school in London where singing and music generally were a very important part of what we did. And I looked forward to the Christmas services with special eagerness. One's mum and dad always came, which was nice. The chapel would be packed, and we rehearsed for weeks beforehand. And so I thought of it as one of the high points of our singing year. And it was actually only a short step to writing carols of my own. I had been singing them since I was a little treble. And it was shortly after my voice changed, I think, that I wrote my first carol for my school choir to sing. It was called the Nativity Carol. I turned it in for a competition, which was being adjudicated by Sir David Wilcox. And it didn't win.
Oh, God.
No, it didn't win, but it did get published and did rather well commercially. I mean, maybe some of your listeners have come across it. It's a soft, gentle little piece. Now, let's fast forward about 8 years to when I was the young co-editor of the second volume of Carols for Choirs, and Sir David Wilcox and I were at our weekly meeting to decide what would be included in the book. And there was a pile of music on his side of the dining room table at 13 Grange Road, where he lived. And lo and behold, there was the Nativity Carol. And he said, "Oh, John, well, we must have the Nativity Carol in the book." I said, "Well, hang on a minute, David." I said, "I turned that in for a competition. I submitted it. And you, as judge, didn't even give it a highly commended. So you can't have thought all that highly of it." And he looked at it and looked up and smiled and said, "I think it's improved remarkably since then, John."
As a chorister, that's such an intense education, and some people criticise it for being too intense. Did you ever feel like it was taking you away from other things?
No, it was just what I did. And I remember when I must have been no more than 4 years old, at my first school day always began with assembly. And we sang a hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, Morning Has Broken, that kind of thing. And I didn't always like the rest of what happened at school. I particularly loathed the sport. But I remember thinking, I just wish the whole day would be singing. So I was a natural. I was no good at sport, but I thought it was nice to be able to contribute to a team effort in some sphere where I was at least half competent. And being in the school choir was a bit like being in the school football team, except you didn't get wet and cold and muddy.
Infinitely preferable, in my opinion.
Well, it was for me.
Yes.
It's not to say that football's not a better option for a lot of young lads and lasses these days, of course. No, the choir was the thing for me.
And at a time where obviously music is under question in terms of music education and music in schools, where do you think choral music lies in that?
Well, it should be for everybody. It shouldn't be the province of an elite. There was a bad decision made in the state school sector back in the 1960s, a long time ago, that school choirs were old-fashioned. There was a time before that when every school had a school choir. And in the 1960s, it was a kind of pop revolution. And it was thought that seeing all those school children in neat rows being directed by their conductor was in some way a relic of the past. And music making in schools moved into a more free-form kind of mode with percussion groups and all that sort of thing. And then electronic keyboards came along. And it's taken really a whole generation to persuade the people in charge of the world of education that a school choir is the soul of that school. And if you take it away, it is like a body without a soul. And of course, it's a very tourable entity as well, because your school or your college can't take its cricket team to America. It can take its choir. And it seems to me that you always have to fight the battle for music somehow. You can never assume that people think it's at the heart of what should happen in our schools and indeed in our churches. You have to sort of say, well, it brings all these benefits of giving kids some corporate activity, keeping them off the streets, exposing them to some of the great music of the past and the present, and feeling that they're contributing something. And we have to keep saying that and hope that the message gets through. There are always pressures to relegate music to the fringes, along with art and drama and sport, because there's this feeling that with limited resources we've got to concentrate on the 3 R's. And of course what people sometimes forget is that the pursuit of music in school, membership of a choir, means that you become that much more literate, not just with present-day English, but with the magnificent language of the Psalms and of the Old King James Bible. But you learn concentration, you learn mental stamina, you learn physical stamina, because you have got to keep your concentration there for the whole length of a rehearsal and a concert or a church service. And it teaches you a kind of must get this right professionalism, which carries through to whatever you may choose to do in life later. It may have nothing to do with music, but I wish somebody would do a scientific survey, proper statistical survey, of what has happened to all our choristers in later life. And I know that you would find a higher than average proportion of people who have risen to the top of their chosen field because they have grown up with the belief that it's not good enough to just get things nearly right. You've got to get them really right. And I sometimes think if musicians were running the country instead of politicians, we'd have a lot better politics. But on the other hand, if you turned all the politicians into musicians, it would sound terrible.
This is true. I work with young choristers. I run a girls' choir, and they did their first service. And one of the 11-year-olds, the youngest, came up to me after the service, and I said, "Oh, how did you think it went?" And she said, "I think we could have done better in the Nunc Dimittis." And that just summed up for me this lovely perfectionism in a good way.
Yes.
And in a lot of schools, they're trying to sort of get rid of the idea of striving for perfection. But actually, music does, as you say, provide a vehicle for positive perfectionism, which I think is incredibly important.
You can have muddled thinking saying that, oh, it's elitist to single out some kids for this. But on the other hand, how would you ever get Manchester United together if you weren't elitist? And I like to think of the musicians in a school or in any community as an elite, but they're not elitist because they, believe me, welcome anyone. That these days, if you've got a young niece or nephew or grandchild who has got some sort of a spark in their eye and a musical gift, why not consider membership of a cathedral or collegiate choir? Because it's the best leg up in life that's available in the educational system in this country. I really do believe that. That was what Alexander Armstrong said at the launch of the Diamond Fund for Choristers, which is a charity to give financial support to choristers throughout Britain. And he said he wouldn't be where he is if it wasn't for having been a chorister. Now, you don't necessarily turn into a comedian, though you may start to see the funny side of all those sermons that you listen to.
Of course. And actually, it's interesting you mentioned sermons. I think there's this bizarre quirk, or not necessarily bizarre, interesting quirk, amongst particularly English choral composers, choral conductors, where they're not necessarily religious, but they imbue the music itself with this sort of reverence. And I heard a quote that they said music's purpose in worship is to bring someone to the threshold of worship, and they can then choose whether they step over. What do you think about that?
I would put the same thought slightly differently and say that music is a great meeting place. This is predominantly a non-church-going age in the West, except in America, which is, of course, a profoundly religiously observant country in a way that's sometimes hard for us in Europe to grasp. But a lot of people have a sense of spirituality which may be quite unfocused and hard to articulate, and very often music can articulate it for them. Yes, it can bring you to the threshold of religious belief, but you can take anything from an inspiring piece of music that you might hear. You never know who's going to stroll into Ely Cathedral or King's College Chapel and take away something that has changed their life and in some way inspired them, brought light into darkness. Many people go through very dark periods in their lives, and I get ever so many letters from people saying that music has brought them through it. Not the words of others, but music. It has extraordinary powers, I think, and its use in religious worship is something that the church cottoned on to centuries ago, and I hope that it remains at the heart of all of our worship in this country, and that it has an honoured place in our concert life. It's interesting that you get performing groups such as the Tallis Scholars and the 16 who perform religious music the whole time, but in the context of a concert, because they know that many people probably will never hear that music sung in a church service. If you listen to a beautiful mass by William Byrd, our native East Anglian composer, you will probably hear more of it sung in concert by some of these wonderful professional vocal ensembles and by amateurs up and down the country. You probably hear more of it there than you will in your local parish church, because you need a good choir to sing it.
you've obviously got this very identifiable style, and almost anyone could probably listen and say, "Oh, that was Rutter."
Really?
But also, I find it interesting that some of your pieces I listen to, and it feels like a very different thing. For example, the recent King Singers commission that you did feels like a very different beast. And I wondered, do you ever feel constricted by the expectation of what your music sounds like?
Yes, you have to work with the flow of the job that you're doing. If somebody commissions you, for example, if you commission your tailor to make you a dinner jacket, beautifully fitted, you wouldn't be very pleased if they came back with jeans and a sweatshirt. Different styles are appropriate for different occasions and for different settings. And of course, in music, performing groups in the world of choral music vary hugely in their size, their capability, their expectations. And as a professional composer, I think it's your job to be sympathetic to that. It's good to stretch your performers, but not to breaking point. And with a group such as the King's Singers, who I've known for decades, almost since the original Six Singers began in the late 60s, I can see you smiling there.
Yes.
Tells us something about our respective ages, doesn't it? But they are such consummate professionals that you can write absolutely anything, however difficult, and know that they'll be able to encompass it, which is not true if you're writing for a local choral society, for example. And so I hope I always speak with my own voice, but not perhaps in quite the same way.
Do you have a favourite Christmas carol?
I did choose for BBC Desert Island Discs. When I was asked to be the castaway on Christmas Day, I picked Harold Dark's setting of Christina Rossetti's text in the Bleak Midwinter. I think for many people that's the quintessential choir carol that you would want to hear. It sounds absolutely perfect in the acoustic of King's College Chapel. And, of course, interestingly, Harold Darke served as organist there during the years of World War II, when Boris Ord was away serving in the RAF. Darke wrote it long before then, but I wonder whether he had some kind of foresight that someday he would be directing the choir of King's College, Cambridge. And I don't know, I'd be interested to find out, whether he ever performed in the Bleak Midwinter during those terrible wartime years in Cambridge. I like to think perhaps he did.